Good afternoon, and welcome to session 3, Examining Empirical Realism. My name is Erin Corcoran, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Kroc Institute, and will be moderating this panel this afternoon. And before we get started with the introduction of the panelists, I wanted to give a little bit of context for this panel. So one of the big questions that we grapple with here at the Kroc Institute in Peace Studies is, why do war and political violence persist? And often political realists argue that violent conflict and the struggle for power are inherent as part of the international system, and there's really very little we can do to manage it. However, as Robert Johansen argues in his path-breaking new work, there are other ways forward. And where the evidence leads, he develops a theory of empirical realism that would allow the United States to more effectively respond to rising security threats. Together, peace and research and security studies show that there are more security benefits are likely to result from maximizing the causes or correlates of peace than from maximizing military power. And so today, our panelists are going to examine this new theory that's laid out in Bob's new book and really answer the question of whether or not empirical realism is a path forward in our current context. And we're really fortunate today to have with us two distinguished panelists. And I'm going to briefly give a bio of each of them, and I'll do it in the order in which they're speaking. So they're each going to speak for about 7 minutes, and then Bob will provide some comments and responses to their contributions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So our first panelist is Alex Dukalski, and he's an associate professor at the University College of Dublin in the School of Politics and International Relations. And he's also the director of the new University College Dublin Center for Asia Pacific Research. He researches on authoritarian states, Asian politics, and international human rights. He has published in several leading journals, including the Journal of Peace Research, Human Rights Quarterly, Journal of Democracy, Review of International Studies, Government and Opposition and Democratization. In addition, he is the associate editor at Communist and Post-Communist Studies, which is published by the University of California Press. And he's published his book, The Authoritarian Public Sphere, Legitimization and Autocratic Power in North Korea, Burma, and China, which is his first book. And last year, he published his second book, Making the World Safe for Dictatorship, with the Oxford University Press. He's also, and for me, I think the most distinguished part of his bio is that he's an alum of the Kroc Institute here for Peace Studies. He also earned his dual PhD in political science and peace studies at the Kroc Institute in the University of Notre Dame. So we're so happy to have you here with us today, Alex. Our second panelist is Richard Falk. And just a word, I mean, my understanding is that Richard is one of Bob's sort of storied mentors for him. And so it's a real honor and privilege for the Kroc Institute and for Bob, for Richard to be joining us here all the way from Turkey. And he is also one of the contributors to the collection of essays that I mentioned briefly in the morning introduction of the symposium that we put together, honoring Bob Johansen, that's available online, open access. And the essay that he contributed for this online collection is entitled Constitutional Guidance for Global Governance. So really happy to have that latest contribution from you, Richard. And he is the Albert Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University and a visiting distinguished professor in Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. In 2001, he served on a 3-person human rights inquiry commission for the Palestine territories that was appointed by the United Nations, and previously on the Independent International Commission on Kosovo. He's the author or co-author of numerous books, and I'm just going to name a few: Reimagining Human Global Governance, Achieving Human Rights, Great War on Terror, Religion and Humane Global Governance, Human Rights Horizons, Explorations on the Edge of Time, Revolutionaries and Functionaries, The Promise of World Order, Indefensible Weapons, Human Rights and State Sovereignty, A Study of Future Worlds, and This Endangered Planet. And between 2008 and 2014, Richard was the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestinian human rights, which he was appointed by the UN Nation Human Rights Council. Again, so we're so happy to have you here with us today, Richard. Thank you for joining us at this late hour for you. I'm going to turn it over to you, Alex, to start off this session 3, Examining Imperial Realism, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's nice to see some familiar faces again. The question we were given to discuss is, does the concept of empirical realism provide a promising theoretical framework for peace-building scholarship and international diplomacy? Perhaps not surprisingly, I'm going to argue yes, that it does provide a promising theoretical framework, and I'll take kind of both in turn and talk about international diplomacy and peace-building scholarship, and why I think it's promising for those two areas. And then I'll make 3 points, maybe for further discussion, that we can hear Bob's response to or further thoughts on. So, is it a promising framework for diplomacy? Yes. And the reason I think it's promising after reading the book is that it takes the strategy of appealing to the self-interest of powerful states. In this case, it's written really for a US audience, to encourage peace-enhancing policies. So it takes the approach that it's in one's self-interest to pursue peace-enhancing policies. So he argues very persuasively, I think, that war has limited utility in today's world, that reducing poverty and reducing poverty increases security, in fact, of the United States. So not only is it a good for in itself, but it has security enhancing effects. Mitigating climate change or addressing climate change makes you safer. These are, I think, are quite persuasive arguments. And the approach helps give policymakers justifications for peace enhancing measures that appeal to multiple audiences, which I think is quite promising. In terms of peace-building scholarship, the theory is promising because it's integrative, it's interdisciplinary, but it's guided by core normative principles as well, which I think is an important kind of foundation of peace scholarship. It takes global interconnectedness into account in ways that many theories and approaches for peace and conflict do not. So, kind of traditional realism is sort of the main, target or intellectual target of the book, and it famously leaves out a lot. Whereas the empirical realism approach, incorporates a lot of different factors, and it also avoids the impulse to kind of separate out and elevate artificially developments that the narrower theories might identify as important simply as a product of the theory. So the answer is yes. I think it's very promising for those reasons. Let me raise 3 points that I might ask Bob to respond to or to elaborate on if he wishes, or he can pick and choose what he wants to discuss. The first point is about kind of the audience. So the main audience of the book is US, I think, scholars, but also US national security or security decision makers. Obviously, this is a very huge topic, and there's a limit to what any one book can do. So this is not a criticism, but rather an extension. Often other great powers in the book kind of play a secondary role. But as we know, and as is alluded to throughout the book, they have agency and policies and interests as well, right? So the main approach for influencing those states in the book seems to be that the US should lead by example, which I think is a good, a valuable thing in its own right, obviously. But there are ways in which interconnectedness can create challenges, in addition to the opportunities that the book so rightly highlights. A recent example is talks between the US and China on climate change. So the Biden and Kerry, Kerry's the climate change envoy, Biden and Kerry very clearly wanted to kind of segment off climate change from other issues in the relationship and make progress on that issue. Xi Jinping and Foreign Minister Wang Yi very clearly wanted, on the contrary, to link it to really acceptance of China's policies particularly with regard to human rights, and now particularly with regard to Taiwan. Now, maybe at the end of the day, both countries will pursue climate change policies, more enlightened climate change policies out of their own self-interest, and maybe we're seeing that a bit already. But linkages in this case provide some constraints, and it's not clear where those trade-offs should be. So I wonder if at times, or if Bob could talk a little bit about the challenges of overcoming some of that interconnectedness. The second point I want to raise is about democracy. So deepening democracy at the local and global level is one of the key planks of empirical realism, which of course, again, I think we can all agree with, and is another area where the US needs to improve its performance. I think that much is very clear. But two, I guess, questions about this. I mean, there are many issues in which the book alludes to not just kind of the US political system being, objecting to a particular measure, but really disproportionately kind of the conservative side of the system having some intransigence and opposition. So I guess the question is how to elevate or package a lot of these empirical realism points for an electoral realm that has all the pathologies that we kind of know it does. Beyond the United States, democracy presents some issues as well. NATO policy, which the book is critical of in various points, is democratically quite popular in Eastern Europe. If you look at the Baltic states and Poland, it's like 80%. And sitting from where they're sitting, that makes perfect sense, right, from their point of view. Sweden and Finland, two very deeply democratic societies, chose to join NATO and therefore ultimately probably expand the alliance. So I guess, how does empirical realism reconcile these genuinely democratic solutions that people perceive to be in their own self-interest, and that you can argue and debate about, but that are at least on face defensible? How are those kind of reconciled with empirical realism? The third question I would ask, or that I would be curious to hear more from Bob about, is the correlates of peace and the priorities of empirical realism. So these range from kind of addressing the fears of all countries to deepening democratic governance. And taken as a whole, can be a little bit daunting. So I wonder how to think about it in digestible chunks without sacrificing the interconnectedness that's such a strength of the theory, and that the theory so rightly emphasizes. Perhaps is there some kind of sequencing, or are there particular strategies or priorities depending on each one of those correlates, or is it a case-by-case kind of call? I'd just be curious to hear some more guidance on that. So in general, overall, yes, this book is very inspiring. It's carefully argued. It's impressive in its range and depth. But of course, as I think the book intends, it provides some avenues for continued discussion. So I'll leave it to Bob to pick up on any, all, or none of those as he sees fit.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. That was really helpful. And I think also, I really appreciate the comments that you provided and some of the questions that I think will be great for when we turn to the Q&A. So Richard, I'm going to turn the mic over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to the Kroc Institute, both for inviting me to participate in further honoring Bob Johansen for this really masterful attempt to project a new paradigm for thinking about international relations, and also for sponsoring a symposium of this quality that recognizes the contribution that Bob has made and has been making over a long and distinguished career. We've known each other for decades and are in substantial agreement about fundamental issues. And so I think the most useful thing I can do is to, in the spirit that Alex just did, is raise a few points that I thought needed to be addressed despite the comprehensiveness and inclusiveness of this truly magisterial work. There are some issues that I found in reading the book that left me wondering. And one of them is the understating of economic motivations for so-called security behavior. And I don't think one needs to introduce into this call for a alternate paradigm a Marxist perspective, but some recognition that the government's defining self-interest and national interests are, to a great degree, shaped by the well-being of isolated economic elites who wield a disproportionate influence in many leading democratic societies, including the United States, to such an extent that commentators have begun to question whether it is still plausible to consider the US a democracy rather than a plutocracy, for instance. And I think that relates closely to another issue, which I know is central to Bob's thinking, which is this feeling, the critique part of his assessment of US security policy as being overly motivated by the pursuit of national interests rather than being sensitive to global interests and global security concerns. My own feeling in the limited interaction I've had with the foreign policy advising groups is that they think they are pursuing global security, and that's part of the problem. I think after the end of the Cold War, there was a feeling that the US was in a position to declare a Monroe Doctrine for the entire world, and that no other country could act except territorially within its boundaries. And I think one of the issues that is confronting the world today in Ukraine and Taiwan is this sense that these countries feel an entitlement to pursue traditional spheres of influence, whereas the US feels it's responsible for security everywhere. And so I think there's an ambiguity embedded in the whole idea of global security, which needs to be clarified. I mean, one of the attractive features of what Bob has done is to show that there has been a failure to learn from the radical shift in the factual underpinnings of international life, including the nuclear dimension and the rise of non-Western nationalism, climate change, that all point to the rationality of cooperative approaches. But there isn't the mindset that can learn from these changed facts. And I don't know how one gains political traction for this alternative paradigm other than through a popular movement in civil society. In other words, I don't think an Enlightenment epistemology that is more attentive to facts and science and rationality can generate the political traction to produce transformative change. And so maybe I should stop with this feeling that perhaps what we need a kind of movement more than we need a shift in the thinking of elites toward what security can provide. If our central purpose is transformative behavior that corresponds to the challenges confronting humanity at this time. And one of the attractive, I'll finish with this, that one of the things I think that maybe could be articulated more fully, but it might disturb some academic readers, is that I read what Bob Johansen has done as a combination of empirical realism and embedded natural law. And that it's the embedded natural law that gives the sense of moral direction, which I think is indispensable if one's to mount a convincing critique of militarism. Let me stop there.
Well, thank you both. Those are really, I think, where you end is sort of, I think, a really relevant point to think about. I'm going to turn this over to Bob to just sort of give your own thoughts and then maybe respond some to the questions that your colleagues have posed to you. And then after that, we'll open this up to the audience to answer some of their questions. And so for those of you who are on the webinar, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom box, and then we will sort of feed those to Bob and the panelists after Bob's done with his remarks. Bob, I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you very, very much, Alex and Richard, for your comments. I find myself in agreement with a lot of what you say, so I wish I could provide better answers than I may be able to, especially on the spur of the moment. But let me try to just make a few comments that relate to what you are saying. First, Alex, I agree with you that there is not a lot of clarity about how to deal with major powers that are linking one issue to another. It's hard to get progress at all. And all I would say is that I'm impressed with some of the research done a few years ago by Bruce Russett and John O'Neill in their book, Triangulating Peace, and in subsequent articles in which they talk directly about the possibility of engaging China in an international network of rules and institutions, especially around trade. and other international organizations. And they say there's a reasonable possibility that skillful diplomacy could do that. And of course, we don't know if that would be true, but we do know that China tried very hard years ago, for self-interested reasons, of course, to get into the World Trade Organization. And it spent a lot of time, waited a long time, I should say, and made some concessions to do that. And this research says the same thing about Russia. And of course, George Kennan, after Gorbachev and Glasnost and Perestroika, warned the United States against things like expanding NATO to the east. And I recognize that these democratic countries like Sweden and Finland are joining, and there's strong support for NATO, but that still doesn't mean that it really was wise for NATO to expand to the east, because a lot of Kennan's warnings seem to come true, because he predicted that to do that would fan the flames of a narrow nationalism in Russia. And it has done that. And it helped bring Vladimir Putin to power. And this traditional sovereign state, highly militarized balance of power system also made it more likely that Russia would invade Ukraine if Ukraine too quickly turned to join the EU and NATO. And so we do have this conflict between democratic demands for some initiatives that I think are not really conducive to global peace and security. And all I would say is that those things need to be mediated, and that it would be much easier to do so in a wise and an effective way if we would be open to transforming the international system when an opportunity does present itself, as I think it did in 1989. And this goes, I have a few comments here that go then to some of what Richard was saying. I agree that let me state it very simply, it's difficult to think our way out of the present situation. Thought alone isn't enough. The interests and the habits are too deeply embedded in the societies, especially of the major powers, to make the transformation that we need. Yes, we do need the social movement at many levels throughout the world to bring about the change. But I also think we need to imagine ways to influence political decision-making that are not limited to simply rational appeal. We have to view the habits that we are following. And I hesitate using that word because there are many differences between individual addictions and social pattern behavior. But there are ways in which our adherence to the guidelines of political realism, not only in the United States, but around the whole world, by decision makers, especially in major powers, that look like addiction in this regard. We keep repeating behavior time after time after time that gives us maybe a short-term reward, but a long-term disaster. Best example of this is the high priority that's placed on military preparedness. We develop a new weapon, we deploy it, and we have a momentary reward. We feel great. We've got this weapon, but nobody else does. But just like taking a drink by an alcoholic, you may feel some immediate reward, but the long-term consequence of not dealing with the habit is disastrous. And as soon as other countries got atomic weapons and hydrogen weapons, MIRVs, drones, the possibility of attack satellites, not just surveillance satellites, all these things are ones where we get a momentary fix, but we have long-run disaster. And so we need to recognize that to to get out of this pattern behavior, we can't just argue that our policies are better than those that are emphasizing military preparedness. We have to try to create new habits that are more constructive to replace the old habits. New habits are ones that I see possible coming up through an enhanced role for international law, through greater democratization of decision-making from local to global, and also an increase in our human identities, a broader sense of inclusivity in human identities and in the human spirit. And these are things that we need to work at as we mediate questions of how do we unlink issues where great powers may want to connect them. I don't have a formula for the sequencing question, and I do think that we need to take a case-by-case look at most decisions, but keeping the long-range vision in mind. If there is any benefit from this book, it is trying to get people to take a vision that looks at the long run as well as the short run. Moving quickly, because of limited time, to Richard's comments, I plead guilty or agreement with your emphasis, Richard, that economic motivation plays a bigger role in decision-making than I have been able to give it in this book, although I do try to acknowledge that it plays an important role. I think it is dangerously pernicious internationally as well as domestically. I think we really have to reevaluate the role or the extent to which capitalist market decisions are helpful and the extent to which they are harmful. And I think they, right now, are hugely problematic in the United States, for example, partly for obvious reasons that an economic elite are controlling a lot of decision-making. Even what gets to the floor of Congress sometimes is determined by that. But also, if you look at the way the profit motive is skewing how social media are affecting democratic processes and repeatedly amplify untruths and spread quickly completely false information, you see the problem, which we're just beginning to understand the extent of the negative consequences of allowing market decisions as much rule as they have had. I agree that we need to find a way to instruct people, educate people about an alternative mindset. It's part of this creating new patterns or new habits that are more constructive and useful than the old one. I also see the wisdom, Richard, in your comment that part of my own analysis here is not simply empirical realism. It is a kind of embedded respect for natural law. I mean, it's not the same, it's not identical, but in one sense, it is present in Hugo Grotius centuries ago. It's present also, I'm happy to say, in Mark Massoud's book on Sharia, that Sharia isn't necessarily the problem, it's what people do with it. And there is a way in which the nature of the universe or of our ideas of natural law or whatever our cultural equivalent might be of that we need to look to those sources for the normative context of living out our political decisions. So I think I've spoken about 10 or 11 minutes, so let me stop there and let others have the floor. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Bob. And I would, so the Q&A is going to open and I will facilitate that. And Alex and Richard, you're invited to turn back on your mics and your cameras, because I'm hoping that this can be a conversation. So, I mean, you know, I'm going to pose some questions and you can talk unless there's one that's specifically directed by an audience member to a specific panelist, I think you should all feel an open invitation to respond to some of the questions that have come in. So the first one's actually a very practical one. And as we know, I mean, while you are all scholars, I think if you're engaged in peace studies, you also are really interested in how you sort of meaningfully make some of this scholarly work actually happen and is realized. And so this question asks for, if you were to write a letter to an editor in a hypothetical, I'm inserting that word, conservative Midwest state, maybe Indiana, with the intention of making an impact on the subject of world peace, what would be an effective perspective to use here? And where would you even begin? I don't want to have to call on anyone.
Well, I'd like to see the other panelists comment on that, but where I would begin is with self-interest myself. I mean, I would inform people that one reason they're so unhappy, if they are, with the outcome of US political processes is that there has been a great democratic deficit that's growing in the United States as a result of interdependence. Fewer and fewer decisions that affect people, even in Indiana, are made exclusively in Washington. They're affected by things that happen all around the world. And they're infected in ways that could be hugely damaging. If there ever is use of nuclear weapons in war, it would affect everybody on the face of the earth. And we are not moving in a direction that is going to increase their security. And so if they want security themselves, they need to look to the security of people in other parts of the world.
Great. Any other thoughts, Alex or Richard?
Yes, I could follow what Bob has just said by saying what I would try to say is that if one looks at the use of the enormous military overinvestment since going back to 1945, and the sense that it's produced very few benefits for the people of the country. And if you look particularly at the wars that the US has intervened in since Vietnam, I think Vietnam was a crucial turning point where people who were alive to Bob's alternative paradigm would have understood that there needs to be a change, that the facts, military power doesn't determine political outcomes, and therefore it's a destructive way of sacrificing lives and resources that could be most alternatively used in much more benevolent ways. And this experience has been repeated in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan, and it has shown that military power doesn't have the agency it had in, let's say, the 19th century. And we just haven't adjusted to it in a way that benefits our society and doesn't do harm to others.
Alex, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, in some sense, this is a question for people who live in these hypothetical states that are being referred to in the question. But I mean, I think an example of where you're seeing, one of the policy areas that you're seeing something interesting happen is around climate change, where you're seeing a lot of policy changes, and you're seeing that arguments can be made to skeptics in self-interested terms. in terms of, they can see changes happening in the climate around them and therefore might support sensible policies. I think you can also appeal to some of the better traditions available in the US, in US political history, can-do spirit, being a global leader of innovation for climate technology. There's some resources you can draw upon there. And to Bob's point, it doesn't all have to be a federal decision, right? Local governments and state governments can do lots of sensible things that might not be on the front page of the national newspaper, but that might make a difference. So that's the best I can do with giving advice on local politics.
That's very helpful. Thank you. This question, the next question from the audience, actually kind of goes back to the point that Richard raised, which was sort of demonstrating in the op-ed sort of how military might doesn't necessarily reap the kind of political outcomes that it may say that it does. And I think the audience member is interested in how do we make the public more aware of this military industrial complex, particularly that we have in the United States. I mean, you all are all aware of it, and I think a lot of people here that are participating. But I think, there are probably people who may not be as knowledgeable about sort of the amount of money that's spent on it, how that influences the ability to spend money in other places in the U.S. government budget, and how that even affects domestic spending. And so maybe if you all might think about, in addition to an op-ed, what are other ways in which people might make the public aware of this issue?
Well, I think that's one of the areas where the facts collide with the economic interests. And therefore, you can try to, Eisenhower way back called attention to the military-industrial complex, and with the authority of the presidency behind him and it being a distinguished military leader, it virtually had no impact. And we should think about, why didn't it have an impact? It certainly rung true if you looked at the way policy was being distorted by this priority accorded to what I've been calling military overinvestment. But the way our so-called democratic system operates, that kind of clear-eyed rationality doesn't get reflected in the way policy is shaped. And there's something wrong with the way in which Congress is subject to special interest lobbying that really distorts the national interest, let alone the global interest. So I think it's very difficult to make the transition from this intellectual coherent framework that Bob has provided us with to its political implementation. And that's why I emphasize, where does the political traction come from? How do we get that political traction? And we've had so many demonstrations that militarism doesn't work in the post-colonial world. And yet, the military budget is increasing. And there is a kind of still a mystique around the military as the institution that keeps us safe and secure. And it's indulged by every political leader of both parties.
Bob or Alex, did you want to follow up with anything before I ask the final question?
I yield my time.
Bob, you wrote the book. You got to take that one.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things to say. One is that, you know, the way in which US political process is failing is because it's not very democratic. I mean, the Senate is not democratic. And the people who are deciding things on the Supreme Court are appointed by presidents who didn't get a majority of the popular vote. So the book calls for democratization. It includes democratization in the United States. And that's not an easy, simple solution. Now, how to bring it about, I don't know. But the traction, we must find a way to get traction by explaining to people and listening to people who are now suffering, whether they know it or not, from a political hierarchy and framework that is really violating their interests in a very fundamental way.
So I have one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you to make a few concluding remarks, and then I'll finish up this panel discussion that's gone also too quickly almost. A lot to talk about here. But this actually sort of speaks to some of the things you already have been talking about. And this particular audience member is interested in, you know, clearly we need some institutional and structural changes to make things different than what they are. And you've all sort of already spoke to that in various different ways. And, you know, I think we understand sort of maybe what the problem is, sort of how some of this stuff is not working, you know, the example that Bob gave about sort of representation in electoral politics. But what are other structural changes that might be needed? Do we need a stronger War Powers Act? Do we need a foreign policy referendum? Do we need sort of other massive legislation, or, you know, or is it back to the local and state? You know, these are some of the, just some thought for you to add, contribute to. So anyone want to start with that?
Well, I have no special wisdom on that, but I think within the United States, we need much better civic education. How to get it, I'm not sure, but you know, our students who go to our public schools don't learn enough about what their role and responsibility are in a democracy. And so that's where this has to begin, I think, in this country. And I know of nothing better than education on these issues all around the world. But Richard is right in asking the question, how do you get political traction? Well, our educational system has to inform people how to assert themselves collectively in order to protect their own interests. We need to be suspicious of concentrations of power wherever they exist. Economic and political power should be viewed very skeptically unless there are transparent ways of keeping checks on how that power is exercised.
But Bob, we're just in a period in the United States where all the tendencies are exactly the opposite. There's a retreat from engaged citizenship that looks at the world in a constructive way. There are efforts at the local level to ban books and to restrict thinking if it collides with conservative values. And so, see, I see the prospects of the US in particular as guided by a drift toward de-democratization. And I wish I didn't, but if one is doing empirical realism, I think it's an imperative that one takes account of unpleasant, inconvenient facts.
Yes, I completely agree with that, Richard, and I try to retain hope about the United States, but I must say I am not optimistic. And I think it's necessary for us to look at progress and leadership from other parts of the world, because part of my analysis is the skepticism about concentrations of power. And of course, the US in a global sense has enormous power, and it needs to be informed and checked by power centers elsewhere in the world. but hopefully these could be nurtured and encouraged through democratic processes.
Okay, so just getting close to when we're going to have to end the session, I would like to just give an opportunity to all three of you to just make a few concluding remarks. And I think it may make sense just to go in the order in which you presented. So I'm going to ask you, Alex, if you wanted to just sort of make any summary remarks based on sort of the conversation we've had over the last hour or so.
Sure. No, I mean, in general, big picture, thank you for the invitation, Bob. Thank you for the opportunity to read the book and to talk with you about it in this format. It was really enjoyable. I think maybe two or three points that come out of our discussion, in the last half an hour or so. I mean, yes, there are obviously a lot of concerning signs with regard to US democracy, but it's not hopeless, in part, I would argue, because some of the tendencies are very asymmetrical between the two parties, right? So in some sense, I think, the part of the solution is to take this to the electoral sphere, and candidates have to make those arguments and prioritize them, and they might lose the first time and the second time and the third time, but things can change over a longer period of time. Ideas that might seem peripheral to the political discourse in year 1, in year 10, are being signed into law in the White House. So, it's definitely, I also, share all the concerns about US democracy, but let's remind ourselves it's asymmetrical in terms of the party system, in my view. And let's not lose hope that some of those policies can be, that seem far-fetched, can come to fruition if candidates prioritize them. So again, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it, and Bob, great to see you.
Thank you, Alex. Richard?
Well, I also enjoyed our conversation, and again, I praise Bob Johansen for producing this stimulating, important book. Again, I feel that the very moral fiber of empirical realism depends on confronting these inconvenient truths. And I'm very discouraged by things like the depth of gun culture in the society, by the prevalence of homelessness, which doesn't exist in any comparably affluent country. And I just think that we, to nurture hope, we have to find some more radical recipe for transformation. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Bob?
What can I say? I agree very much, and I'm grateful for both Alex and Richard's comments. And just on a personal note, imagine the treat that I feel to have a student, Alex Dukalski, here commenting on my work, and also to hear comment on it from the graduate school professor I had, who probably exerted more influence on my thinking than anyone else, in Richard Falk. So this is indeed a very uplifting moment. In response to the pessimism that we feel, I want to refer to one thing that Richard has said from time to time that I never would forget, and it was that social science knowledge isn't sufficient to enable us to be absolutely sure that there is no hope, that the unexpected may sometimes happen. And I'm not placing all my hope on that idea, but I think it's possible for breakthroughs to occur in ways we cannot foresee. This happened with Gorbachev and Glasnost and Perestroika. It happened also in the elimination of apartheid without a bloodbath in South Africa. The task for scholars and students is to be prepared for opportunities if and when they arise. And so what we're doing is trying to create a vision that gives people a place to stand and a place to advocate from for what needs to happen, even when we can't see clearly how it's going to happen. But I do believe that if we listen carefully to the voices that are struggling to be heard, we will find a way to build alliances, political alliances, and transnational coalitions with those who can bring more realism into the minds of the great powers that may resist progressive change that's needed. So, although this book was written heavily with the United States in mind, it isn't because I think the message is only for the United States. The coalition that gives me the most hope would be a possible coalition between transnational social movements of individuals allied with progressive governments. And there are some. There are some. You know who they are. And then also with international organizations that have as a structural reality and duty to serve the planet as a whole. That's the kind of coalition that might make a difference. And that could possibly change legislation, even in the great powers in the long run. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to make a couple of concluding remarks. I mean, I think one of the things that I think Bob always is able to bring to the table, and it's something that you hear that his students talk about and others who have been mentored by him, is while he is very great at identifying the real problems and unmasking some of these truths, he's also never without hope, right? And I think that that's something that's really important. And, you know, where I sit at the Kroc Institute, one of the biggest views of hope for me is our students, right? And sort of getting them exposed to these ideas, helping them sort of think about the world differently and putting them out in the world in a way that they're critical of the existing power structures, willing to sort of speak truth to power, and sort of understanding some of the normative lenses in which peace studies offer to sort of approaching these problems. And I think, you know, as the Kroc Institute has become part of the Keough School, one of the things that I think it's become evident that the mission of the Keough School is also really much informed by integral human development and sort of recognizing the inherent human dignity in individual people, particularly those that are the most vulnerable. And while it's, you know, it's informed by Catholic social teaching, I think it's larger than the Catholic Church. I think it's about sort of understanding our ethical obligation as peace builders and peacemakers to be making sure that those who are the most vulnerable in society are taken care of. And I think all of you sort of reflected upon that and identified that as something that is sort of part of how Bob has articulated his understanding of empirical realism. And I think there's also been a start of discussion and most evident in Bob's concluding remarks about the need for sort of, you know, social movements and engagement by international organizations with normative frameworks, and that really change has to come right from the local and the bottom up to the top. And so I would encourage all of you who are on this current session to tune in for session 4, because that's exactly what session 4 is going to be addressing, which is social movements and international organizations. And that will be moderated and facilitated by Ann Hainer, our alumni director, who will be sort of kicking that off. So again, thank you, Alex and Richard, for being here today. Again, Bob, it's just great to be engaged with you in this sort of intellectual conversation. And I certainly have learned a tremendous amount, and looking forward to session 4. Take care.